It was a hot, humid night, with the sky heavy with clouds, when the protagonist entered the small convenience store. The air inside was stifling, and the hum of the refrigerators was the only distraction from the oppressive silence. Behind the counter, the young clerk, his face marked by acne, seemed bored, lazily packing a customer's items. Exhausted, the protagonist, with a folded map in his pocket, felt a knot of tension in his throat as he approached the counter. The young man finally looked up, halting his movements as if frozen in time. The scene felt strange, like something in the air was off. When the clerk finally spoke, his voice was monotone and uninterested. "Yeah, what do you want?" he asked with a distant look, making the protagonist hesitate for a moment before continuing. Relieved not to be outright dismissed, the protagonist pulled the map from his pocket. He explained how he had gotten lost on the deserted roads in the area. His decision to take those back roads now seemed like a mistake, especially with the growing sense of isolation. He spread the map out on the counter, hoping the clerk could help him find his way back to the main road. The clerk, however, responded mockingly. A soft chuckle turned into laughter as he ridiculed the use of a paper map, calling the protagonist old-fashioned. "Dude, are you serious? Who uses a paper map these days?" he said, still laughing. Frustration welled up inside the protagonist, but he held it in. He knew the young man wouldn't understand the value of old things, like his 1979 Honda Accord. After a few more jokes, the clerk finally pointed to a spot on the map, indicating an area near Placer. The protagonist, still wary of the young man's attitude, marked the location with a pen. Despite the trivial nature of the interaction, it left a lingering sense of unease, as though something was out of place. The clerk's mockery seemed to hide something darker, something the protagonist couldn't quite identify. As he left the store, the protagonist was immediately struck by the sudden change in sounds and sensations. The constant hum of fluorescent lights and the mechanical noise of the refrigerators were replaced by the sounds of nature. The persistent chirping of crickets and cicadas filled the air, a stark contrast to the artificial environment of the store. The sky was dark with no visible moon, and the surrounding trees seemed to close in like a wall, creating a claustrophobic atmosphere. He took a deep breath, trying to appreciate the fresh night air, but the feeling of isolation was undeniable. In the distance, he heard the faint call of an owl, followed by what sounded like an elk. The forest around him was alive, but at the same time, deeply deserted. Every sound seemed amplified by the silence of the road, which only heightened the tension in the air. As he walked to his car, the protagonist took one last look at the store. The harsh lights contrasted with the darkness of the forest, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something or someone moving near the entrance. However, no one was there. Still, the sensation of being watched began to grow inside him, like a shadow silently following him. He opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat, trying to shake off the paranoia that was starting to form in his mind. The forest seemed too quiet, as if it were waiting for something. It was a strange feeling, a mixture of unease and alertness that he couldn't fully explain. He lit a cigarette, hoping the smoke would help calm his nerves. As he started the car, the familiar sound of the engine roaring to life brought him a brief sense of relief. He glanced around one last time before finally deciding to leave. Something about that store, about that forest, seemed wrong. But he didn't know what, and he hoped it was just his exhaustion speaking. He was about to find out that his instincts were right. When the protagonist got into the car and closed the door, he was immediately startled by a voice coming from the passenger seat. For a brief moment, panic took over, and he spun around in his seat, his heart racing in his chest. The sight of Craig, his old friend, sitting calmly beside him, brought a wave of relief mixed with embarrassment. He had completely forgotten that Craig was there, waiting for him while he ran into the store. Craig, laughing at the protagonist's stunned expression, asked if he had really forgotten he was in the car. The protagonist tried to play it off, blaming the unsettling interaction with the store clerk. The tension in the air seemed to have affected his memory momentarily. Craig's laughter was a welcome relief, bringing a brief sense of normality to the strange night. Craig had always been a constant companion on their late-night road trips. They loved hitting the road with no set destination, listening to music, and talking about life. But that night, something felt different. The deserted road, the isolated store, and the discomfort the protagonist had felt upon leaving were beginning to weigh on him. Despite the laughter, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After a brief moment of silence, the protagonist offered Craig a drink, trying to distract his mind. They opened their soda bottles and continued chatting as the car moved along the road. The engine purred softly, and the music playing on the radio was almost comforting. But in the background, a faint sense of unease persisted, something the protagonist couldn't fully identify. As they continued down the dark road, the protagonist cast one last glance at the store in the rearview mirror. He expected the clerk to have gone back to his work by now, but to his discomfort, he saw the young man standing in the doorway, watching the car drive away. The clerk didn't move, didn't wave, just stared, with an unnerving intensity. The discomfort that had once been mild was now beginning to turn into something more sinister. As the car smoothly rolled down the road, the protagonist couldn't shake the image of the clerk standing in the doorway. Something about the way the young man watched them felt wrong. It was as if he was seeing beyond the surface, as if he knew something they didn't. That penetrating, expressionless stare deeply disturbed the protagonist. He tried to ignore the feeling, but the image of the clerk continued to haunt his thoughts. Craig, sensing his friend's growing discomfort, cracked a light-hearted joke to ease the tension. However, the laughter was brief, and the protagonist barely responded. He knew Craig was right to try to downplay the situation, but something inside him insisted that there was something very wrong that night. Every time he looked in the rearview mirror, he expected to see only the dark, empty road behind them, but the feeling of being watched remained. He wondered if he should have asked the clerk something more, if there was a detail he had missed in their earlier conversation. Perhaps the young man's mocking manner was just a front for something more sinister. The protagonist's mind began to wander down unsettling paths. Craig continued to try to keep the conversation light, but even he was starting to notice the heavy silence settling in the car. The forest around them seemed to grow denser, the trees closing in like a wall, while the car's headlights cut through the darkness in a limited way. The protagonist cast another quick glance in the rearview mirror, convinced that at any moment he would see something unexpected. Finally, he decided to voice his concern to Craig, who only laughed and said he was being paranoid. But the protagonist couldn't join in the laughter. Something about that night felt out of place, as if an invisible shadow was growing around them. And no matter how much he tried to push the thought away, the image of the clerk standing motionless in the store's doorway wouldn't leave his mind. Then, without warning, a figure appeared in the road ahead, emerging from the shadows of the forest. The protagonist, lost in his own thoughts, noticed the woman at the last second. With a shout, he slammed on the brakes with all his strength, as his heart seemed to leap into his throat. The car skidded violently, the tires screeching against the asphalt as the vehicle swerved out of control. The car finally came to a stop, turning at a dangerous angle, the back end sliding on the road. For a brief moment, the protagonist sat in silence, his eyes wide, his body tense. He looked at Craig, who also seemed to be in shock. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds, both processing what had just happened. The sound of the idling engine and the hum of the radio were the only noises inside the car. Recovering from the shock, the protagonist got out of the car, his legs trembling as he walked to the front, where the figure should have been. But to his horror, there was no one there. He looked to both sides of the road, expecting to see someone running to hide in the forest, but there was no movement, no evidence that anyone had been there. The feeling of fear returned in full force. He walked to the edge of the road, his eyes scanning the darkness between the trees. The forest, once filled with the sounds of insects and nocturnal animals, was now eerily silent. A cold chill ran down the protagonist's spine. He knew he had seen someone, but where had that person gone? The thought that he might have imagined it began to haunt him, but something in his gut told him that wasn't the case. When he returned to the car, Craig looked at him with a worried expression. He couldn't believe that his friend had seen someone in the road. Still, the tension between them was palpable. "Maybe it was just your mind playing tricks on you," Craig suggested. But the protagonist knew otherwise. He had seen a woman in the road. Something was deeply wrong that night. After the incident with the woman in the road, the atmosphere inside the car became even more tense. The sense that something was wrong, that there was an invisible presence around them, grew with each passing minute. The protagonist tried to focus on driving, but his eyes kept scanning the surroundings, as if he expected to see someone lurking between the trees at any moment. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. He couldn't shake the idea that there were hidden eyes tracking their every move. It wasn't just paranoia. It was an instinctual certainty that he couldn't ignore. The silence between him and Craig made everything even more unbearable, as if both of them were aware but too afraid to verbalize what they were feeling. Every time the protagonist looked in the rearview mirror, he expected to see something more than just the dark, empty road. His breathing quickened, and his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his fingers were turning white. Craig, normally talkative, was also quiet, his eyes fixed on the road but occasionally glancing out the window. The fear was taking hold of both of them. Then, the feeling of being watched intensified. The protagonist felt as if something was approaching, a presence he couldn't see but knew was there. He looked at Craig, hoping his friend was feeling the same thing, and the frightened look on Craig's face confirmed he wasn't alone in his fear. Something was definitely watching them, following them in the darkness. They didn't know what it was, but it was clear that they were no longer alone on that road. Something or someone was out there, lurking in the darkness, and at any moment, it could make its presence known in a much more threatening way. The protagonist tried to focus on driving, but the feeling was overwhelming. It was beginning to feel like a race against time, or something much worse. As the protagonist drove deeper into the dark road, a sense of déjà vu began to set in. At first, he wasn't sure if he was just getting lost in his thoughts, but soon he realized something more disturbing. The road seemed to be leading them back to the same place over and over. Craig began to notice it too. They had passed that same streetlight, with the worn sign pointing to the ghost town of Golden, at least twice. The protagonist tried to convince himself it was just a coincidence, that maybe the road was looping, but as the repetition persisted, his discomfort turned into panic. He looked at Craig, hoping his friend had a logical explanation for what was happening. But Craig was just as confused as he was. Each time they passed the same point, the tension in the car grew. The silence became unbearable, and the protagonist began to speed up, hoping to break the cycle. Each time they passed the streetlight, the protagonist noticed more unsettling details. The sign for Golden was riddled with bullet holes and seemed increasingly damaged, as if time was accelerating for that spot alone. The darkness around them felt thicker, more oppressive, and the natural sounds of the forest were disappearing. He knew something was deeply wrong. This wasn't just a coincidence. They were trapped in some kind of bizarre loop. Craig, who had been trying to keep his cool up until then, started to lose his composure. He gestured nervously for the protagonist to stop the car and figure out what was happening. But the protagonist, already consumed by desperation, couldn't stop. He knew something was waiting for them at that point, something invisible but deadly. The idea of stopping the car and getting out to investigate seemed like the worst option. What might they find if they did? As they passed the streetlight once more, something changed. The road seemed darker and the air heavier. With each repetition, the feeling of being watched grew until it became unbearable. Now it wasn't just a sense of being watched from afar. It felt as though the very shadows around them were closing in on the car, slowly, waiting for the right moment to strike. Craig looked at the protagonist, his face pale and sweating. "This can't be happening," he whispered. After yet another pass through the same point, the two friends noticed something even more terrifying. Now, there was a physical presence by the side of the road. In the distance, under the streetlight, a female figure stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the car. She wore an old dress, stained with something dark, perhaps blood. Her face was a blurry smear in the darkness, but her presence was undeniable, and with each pass, she seemed to be getting closer. The protagonist accelerated the car, trying to ignore the woman by the roadside, but Craig was already panicking. "Did you see that? She's getting closer," he yelled, his voice filled with fear. With each repetition of the cycle, the mysterious woman became clearer, more real, as if she were materializing out of nowhere. And the most frightening part was that she wasn't alone. As time passed, more figures began to appear around her. Indistinct shadows, moving slowly, emerging from the darkness as if drawn to the presence of the two friends. The figures were distant at first, but soon they began to gather near the road, silently watching as the car passed. The protagonist, now in a near state of panic, tried to ignore the growing army of shadows. These figures weren't human, or at least not anymore. Their bodies were distorted, as if they had been shaped by the very darkness itself. They stood at the edge of the road, watching, but not approaching. Still, their proximity was suffocating, as though they were waiting for the right moment to act. The protagonist could barely breathe as he drove past them, feeling the weight of their empty gazes on him and Craig. The woman leading the group, with her blood-stained dress, continued to stand at the front. Her face, though still indistinct, seemed fixed in a silent scream, as if she were trying to warn them of something, or worse, invite them to something. The protagonist knew that if they stopped, those figures would do more than just watch. The fear consumed him, and he pressed the gas pedal, praying that the cycle would break somehow. But with each pass, the number of figures grew. Craig, who had been reacting with the same fear as the protagonist, began to change his behavior. His voice, once filled with panic, was now strangely calm. He started asking disjointed questions, as if detached from the growing terror around them. "Are you scared, Derek?" he suddenly asked, in a tone that seemed cold and distant, something completely out of character. The protagonist, already on the verge of a nervous breakdown, felt a chill run through his body at the sound of Craig's voice. Something was definitely wrong with him. The tension in the car was palpable, but Craig seemed to have slipped into a state of indifference, as if he were watching everything from a different perspective. The protagonist shot a quick glance at his friend, but Craig's face was partially hidden in the car's shadows. The sense that something had changed fundamentally in Craig began to grow. The tone of his questions was unsettling, almost as if he were toying with the protagonist. "Do you think we'll get out of this?" he asked softly, with a smile that the protagonist couldn't see but could feel. The atmosphere in the car was unbearably heavy, and the protagonist began to feel afraid of his own friend. Craig started to laugh quietly, a sound that sent chills down the protagonist's spine. It was a laugh he had never heard before, almost inhuman, cold, and calculated. The protagonist tried to stay calm, but the way Craig was acting was deeply disturbing. Something was wrong with him, something unnatural. It was as if the presence of the figures on the road was beginning to affect him somehow. Finally, the protagonist couldn't take it anymore. "Craig, what's happening to you?" he asked, his voice trembling with fear. Craig slowly turned his face toward the protagonist, his eyes glowing strangely in the dim light. "I've always been here, Derek. Always," he replied, with a smile that stretched unnervingly wide. The protagonist knew, in that moment, that Craig was no longer the person he knew. Something had possessed him, something that came from the shadows that surrounded them. Panic overwhelmed the protagonist. Without thinking, he jerked the steering wheel sharply, trying to swerve the car away from the shadows that seemed to be closing in around them. The sudden movement caused the vehicle to spin out of control. The screech of tires against the asphalt echoed through the forest, followed by the roar of the engine as the car began to skid violently across the road. He knew he couldn't brake hard, or the car would flip, but his survival instincts took over. The car spun in a wild spiral, the world around them becoming a blur of lights and shadows. For a brief moment, the protagonist saw Craig's face turn toward him again, still wearing that grotesque, inhuman smile. Time seemed to slow as the car careened toward the trees on the side of the road. With no other choice, the protagonist acted purely on instinct. He opened the door and jumped from the moving car. The impact with the ground was brutal. Darkness quickly enveloped him as his body hit the earth with force, rolling several times before coming to a stop in a bush by the roadside. Everything went silent. Only the searing pain and the distant sound of twisting metal indicated that the car had finally crashed into something. When he opened his eyes, the world around him was cloaked in shadows. He could feel the warmth of blood trickling from his forehead and the sharp pain in his arm. But miraculously, he was alive. Struggling to his feet, he looked toward the wrecked car. The headlights now pointed into nothingness, illuminating the interior of the dark forest. The vehicle was mangled, its front completely smashed. But something was missing. Craig. The passenger seat was empty, and the door was open. A wave of fear washed over the protagonist as he realized his friend had disappeared. The shadows around him seemed to be closing in more and more, and the silence of the night was suffocating. He tried to move, but the pain in his body made every step a torment. He was alone on that deserted road, with only the wrecked car and the shadows to keep him company. The protagonist woke up in a hospital room, the sound of machines and harsh white light hitting him hard. He blinked, trying to get his bearings, feeling a deep ache in his arm and head. When his vision finally cleared, the first thing he saw was Vanessa, his girlfriend, sitting beside the bed. Her eyes were red from crying, and when she realized he was awake, she rushed to hug him, sobbing with relief. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain stopped him. The doctor entered soon after, explaining the severity of his injuries: a fractured arm, severely bruised ribs, and a deep cut on his head that required several stitches. "You're lucky to be alive," the doctor said, his tone serious. He explained that a man and his son had found him unconscious by the side of the road and had immediately called an ambulance. However, something about the way the doctor looked at him made the protagonist uneasy. "The police are here to speak with you," the doctor said before leaving the door slightly ajar. Two officers entered the room shortly afterward, their expressions serious. They asked about the accident, about what had happened on the road. The protagonist told them everything, except for the most disturbing details. He couldn't mention the figures on the road or what Craig had become. That would sound too crazy. The officers listened intently, and when he finished, they exchanged glances. "We've been getting some strange reports from that area. Stories similar to yours," one of the officers said reluctantly. Before leaving, they made it clear they would investigate, but that they hadn't found anyone at the scene of the accident besides him. Craig, or whoever had been in the car with him, had disappeared. Only the open passenger door and the total wreckage of the car remained as evidence. The protagonist tried to process everything as Vanessa held his hand. He clearly remembered Craig being with him, his disturbing laughter, his eyes changing. But now Craig was nowhere to be found. The anguish of losing his friend, combined with the horror of what he had witnessed, left him in a state of confusion and deep fear. Something far darker was at play, and he knew that the truth about what had happened on that road went far beyond what he could comprehend. Time passed, but the memories of that terrible night continued to haunt the protagonist. Even after 3 months of recovery, he couldn't escape the nightmares. The image of Craig's distorted smile, the shadowy figures by the roadside, and especially the woman in the blood-stained dress. These memories were seared into his mind. He knew that something supernatural had occurred, but no logical explanation existed. Then, one day, he received an email from an unknown sender. The content left him frozen. It was from the store clerk, the young man he had seen that night. In the email, the boy explained that his father, the owner of the convenience store, had seen strange things in that area for many years. Things he had never believed until that night, when he saw the protagonist and Craig in the store. The boy described the woman and the others who lurked along the road as if they were figures from local legends. The email detailed the history of the road, how those figures were trapped in an endless cycle, trying to warn people of something far worse. The clerk said he had seen Craig change that night, just as the protagonist had. "You were never with your friend," the message said, "at least not in the way you thought." The young man insisted that something had possessed Craig that night, something that had used his form to haunt the protagonist. The final blow came to the protagonist in the form of a message he could never forget. As he tried to understand the truth behind Craig's transformation, he recalled Vanessa's message from that night. Trembling, he opened his phone and reread the words she had sent, which made him freeze in horror. "Honey, who's Craig?" The memory of all the moments with Craig seemed to unravel in his mind, as if they were only shadows of something that had never existed. The revelation destroyed him. Craig had never been real, or at least he had never been his friend. He was a manifestation of something evil, something that had followed him on the road and almost led him to his death. The protagonist swore never to drive at night again, never to return to that road. But even so, he knew the shadows were watching him, and the question would forever burn in his mind. Who was Craig?